All right, Corey, tell me a little bit about Skillable.
So Skillable is a bit of an interesting company. So Skillable is I like to call it a 20-year-old startup. We got started in our business, which is experiential learning, hands-on labs, software demos, that sort of thing. Really back at and I love saying this, at around the turn of the century. Which granted is
You could
22
say
years
turn of
ago.
the millennium, couldn't you?
And I could do that, but turn of
Yeah.
the century sounds better. Um, and we for probably the first 10, 12 years of the company, we focused around big trade shows and conferences. And what was interesting about that is, you had a group of people, fairly small at the time, that lived in all sorts of parts of the world. I had a Danish guy, I had a German person, I had a couple of Australians, I had Canadians, and we would coalesce in these cities for really intense periods of like 2 weeks at a time. And then we'd all go home and we'd plan the next thing, and we'd coalesce, we'd go home, we'd plan. And as the company, kind of got bigger over the last couple of years, we're up to now, I think, about 180, 190 employees, spread across about 12 or 15 different countries all over the US, all over the world. We sort of never got away from that. It doesn't matter where you are. It matters what you do and how
Mm.
you contribute. And so we've come up through the last 20 years, with the last really 5 or 6 being really phenomenal, 30, 40, 50% growth years. And at no point have we ever had an office.
Mm.
Um, and so it's fun. It's great. I love
So
it.
that's actually one of the things that fascinates me about this because, for you being, remote only basically since your formation, that that
Mhm.
puts you in an unusual category, right? So there are, of course, many companies figuring out how to do this right now. It sounds like you evolved naturally into it. Was there ever a point where you were thinking about the idea of having an office? Did that ever even come into your head?
A lot, actually. And so I'd say, for us, we were doing remote before
Hmm.
remote was cool. We had the pleasure of, when COVID hit and all these companies had to shut down and try to figure out remote. We're kind of sitting there going, guys, this is actually
Hmm.
not that hard. Everyone is kind of scared. How are they going to deal with it? It's the best thing ever. It's the most productive way you could be. It's the happiest way you can be. It's the best work-life balance. Um, and we had the privilege of being able to help a lot of people. I had many other founders of companies and reach out to me and, how do you do this? And we're able to help and help them evolve. But for us, it's just been, we've never
Hmm.
known anything else. I don't know that we could ever function any other way. It's so ingrained in just the life and the culture and the way people operate and the type of people that succeed here. I think if you were to take our staff and put them in an office, I don't think I don't think it'd work. I don't think they'd succeed. Now, kind of back to your question, which is, yes, this has been intentional, right? Have we ever debated having an office? Many, many times. And I think where we ultimately settled on was, even though we're 100% remote, and as an example, I'm here in Tampa, Florida. I've got about 30 employees, within a 1 hour drive that I've never seen, in
Hmm.
probably 6 months. Um, Even though we're remote, it's important that
Yeah.
people get together, right? And so, we, over the course of many times said, hey, should we have an office? Should we have just a meeting space where folks can go to if they want to? And what we settled on was, it didn't make a lot of sense to have dedicated space or dedicated office space or anything of the sort. But what was important is giving people the opportunity to come together and just build a social
Yeah.
bond. Work is great, and we feel hyper connected because of technology. I feel more connected to the guys that are on the west coast of the country, than I do some of the guys down the street, because I work with them every day. We're on video or on audio, we're interacting, we have chat, we have this is sort of constant influx of just interactions. Um, but it doesn't replace the let's get everyone together, let's build the social network, let's build the connections, let's build the bond. And so, what we decided to do, and this was the intentional part, is allocate money, allocate budget for what we call them co-working sessions. Really what they are is, we'll book a hotel room or a hotel conference space in some city, and we'll take a team, maybe our dev team or a support team, and say, you're going to work from here this week. We don't even necessarily put an agenda on them. We just say, come here, you're going to do your day job. Whatever you did in your remote office, you're going to do in this room, but now you're in a room
Yeah.
with your peers. And,
Mm.
some of the organic things that happen, when that happens are just, absolutely amazing. We do other things too, but, I love those.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, Corey, and it's a theme that actually we're starting to see now. I think the theme is quite surprising for some people that are encountering this the first time, but not for folks that have lived the remote lifestyle or built up a company that has been remote. And what that theme is that when you start from the perspective of being in office, and then that gets disrupted by something like COVID or whatever, right? The natural tendency is to solve whatever you think your problems are by pulling everybody back into the office because it's what you know, right? There's really interesting articles written about the Amazon decision to pull people back in. I think 3 days a week, and in it, they talk about the fact that many of their best discoveries have happened after a whiteboarding session or ad hoc whiteboarding session after an in-person meeting, as though that's the only way in which you
Mhm.
can stimulate innovation or anything along those lines. And of course, the reason for that is you're looking back and you're seeing what worked previously and you're looking to try to recreate that. But what's interesting is that if you've not started from an in-office environment, then you have the capacity to make much clearer headed decisions. Like, what is it that we need to do in order to be able to create ad hoc collaboration sessions that work really well? What is it that we need to do in order to spark innovation inside the organization? And there can be many answers to that question, and one of those answers might be pull everybody back into the office, but it's only one of
Yep.
the answers. And I think it's really interesting how organizations that have lived this long enough start to see that there are multiple ways to skin that particular cat. And in many ways you're speaking to that as you're pulling people in different locations and just having them there for a week, and then having them go their separate ways for the rest of the time. That's kind of the sort of stuff that you are able to see that other people cannot necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a few things to sort of unpack in that thought. One of them is I do agree that some of the best innovation happens on a
Hmm.
whiteboard after the meeting, right? But you don't need to commute every day or 2 days a week or 3 days a week
Yeah.
to get that, right? How often do you have those meetings where those great innovation session happens? You know, it's probably not every week or, maybe every
Hmm.
couple of weeks. But if you facilitate those opportunities, they become even more powerful and even more valuable. For us, for example, it's, we take, a group of people, maybe we get them together every, 6 weeks or 8 weeks for a couple of days. Um, we get way more out of that condensed period of time. It becomes a very sort of intense session to be, it's all this sort of pent
Yeah.
up creativity, these pent up ideas, these pent up conversations. And, we walk out of those things going, oh my God, like we covered so much ground in such a short period of time. Now go
Yeah.
away and execute. Right. And at some point, you know, that starts to kind of run out. Okay, it's time to get together again and have one of these really intense sessions. We're having one next week, for example, around our customer journey. We've got about 4 people coming, actually about 8 people coming in
Hmm.
for 2 days. And it will be 2 really intense days, but we will cover in those 2 days, what would have ordinarily taken people a
Yeah.
week to cover. And then we'll go away, and go back and execute, right? And I think what we're finding with our staff in particular is, they
Hmm.
love that, right? They love this idea that, I can have this incredible work-life balance. I can execute on what I need to do, but then they get excited about these collaboration sessions, right? They want to go in, they want to be all in for a couple of days. They want to cover a lot of ground, because they're excited to see their peers. They're excited to work with them, but at the same time, they can't wait to get back
Yeah.
and do the work.
Yeah. Really, really, really interesting stuff. You're talking about the employees. Let's go into that in a bit more detail. From your
Mhm.
perspective, what makes a good remote employee?
Um, so I think there's a couple of things, right? And I would preface by saying not everybody functions well in
Mm.
this environment, and you have to hire for this environment. We are very intentional in our hiring process to make sure that we're properly evaluating candidates to make sure that we know they're going to be successful in an all remote world. And there's different ways we do that and different techniques we employ, but we're very, very deliberate about it. It's it's a case of someone who excels in the office, you know, may not excel working from home. Someone who works from who excels working from home may not excel in the office, right? And a lot of it comes down to I'm going a little bit off topic in terms of the traits of the person, but we just stop on the hiring process for a second. A lot of it comes down to you get that person for 8 hours a day. What does the other
Yeah.
16 hours look like, right? For some people, the office might be their escape, right? They get out of the house, they can go there, they can focus, they can be productive. Another person being in the office might be the biggest stressor they have because they're worried about the cat, the dog, grandma, grandpa,
Hmm.
the kids, right? They've got this incredible schedule to juggle at home. You reverse that around, a person that works from home that's got, a schedule to juggle and can juggle it, they become more productive because you've taken the stress away of
Yeah.
everything else, right? So a lot of it is coming down to, what else factors into the employee's world, their total 24 hours of the day. What else factors in besides just the job? Because that has a tremendous impact on their ability to be productive. Does that kind
It
of make
does,
sense?
and
I feel
really
like I
I
rambled a
think
bit.
it's a really interesting insight, and I'd love to dive in a little more to how you go about finding that out. So, what do you do in order to be able to determine that before you even hire somebody?
Well, so there's a few things, and number one, you've got to be
Mhm.
careful, because obviously there's
Yeah.
employment law and stuff like that you got to be cognizant of. But I try to focus in on a couple of things. Number one is education, right? Anyone that is coming into a 100% work from home environment, you have to educate them on what
Yeah.
that's really like, right? And and a lot of the education comes down to kind of a couple of things, which is, first of all, what's your support system
Mhm.
like at home? Okay, and I'll give you a couple of examples of things we've had to deal with over the years. We had an employee who almost quit, and it was they were doing great, and then you were kind of detecting the stress at work, and spent some time on it, and they almost left because what they were, the fact that they were working from home was creating tremendous issues
Mhm.
in their marriage because their partner didn't understand that, hey, when I go to work in the morning, I can't do the laundry, the dishes, and walk the dog because I'm at work. I have meetings. The partner didn't understand that. Hey, you're at home. You should be able to do the dishes and walk. It's only
Mhm.
5 minutes. And our employee is like these mental interruptions. Like if I defocus to go, do laundry, do dishes, walk a dog, do home chores during my workday, it impedes my ability to be productive. And this created a lot of tension in
Mhm.
that relationship. Now, we were able to, educate the employee and they were able to work it out and it all worked out in the end. But a lot of folks that are new, they
Yeah.
underestimate that, right? They underestimate, the importance of having if obviously if you're alone, that's one thing, but if you have a family, or a partner, of underestimating the importance of that network being bought into
Yeah.
what you're doing, right? So that's kind of one point of education. The second area we try to really educate people is their social network, right? And so I'll give you a question that I ask almost every employee we hire, which, and the question goes something like this. So think about, the old concept of 6 degrees of separation, right? Every person's connected, 6 degrees is everyone else in the world. And I say, here's the question. I want to say, I want you to tell me three people that you've had a social interaction with, had a beer, had a coffee, gone, whatever, in the last 14 days that you cannot connect to
Mhm.
your job, right? The whole 6 degrees of separation counts. Oh, it's my coworker's brother, or it's my, you know, my daughter's friend is my coworker's friend. Those sorts of things. Take all those out. Tell me three or four social interactions you've had that you cannot connect
Mhm.
to your job, and you'd be amazed how many people
Yeah.
can't do that, right? And so that leads into what we refer to as the 3 month rule, which is if someone's going to be successful in this world, you're going to know within 3 months, right? 3 months, they're either going to be a rock star or you're going to be
Mhm.
parting ways. And what happens to those folks that can't articulate those relationships, they It kind of goes like this. They get the job, they're working from home. It's great. It's, hey, I'm home. I can work-life balance. I can, get a coffee, work in my PJs, flexible hours. It's all great. And, they wake up 3 months later and they realize
Yeah.
they're lonely because those forced social interactions of being around people, right? Not on video, not on phone calls, but of being actually interacting with people have all faded away because they were all tied to
Yeah.
the office, right? And for us, it's particularly true because we have states where we have one employee,
Yeah.
right? So we have to know that the support system beyond the person exists for that person to just be job aside, to just be functional and successful in the
Yeah,
environment.
Corey, we've seen exactly that. And I think what's very interesting is the 3-month rule that you're talking about here, because working outside an office can feel very different from day one, but the full scope of what working outside of the office is like tends to unfold over a longer period of time than that, right? So you're not going to feel
Yeah,
lonely on day one, for example, right? But over time,
yeah,
that that can build up. And so, what's interesting in the interviews that we've done, and this has been borne out by external research by things like McKinsey and so on, is that if you just give people a plain choice and you say to people, would you like to walk into an office every day, or in most cases, drive into an office every day in the US, right?
yeah.
Would you like to do that? Or would you prefer to work from home? Then McKinsey says 87% of people choose the work from home or work from anywhere option. We've seen very similar numbers, right? So in other words, where you give people somebody the choice, they almost inevitably pick the choice that gives them more flexibility. Why wouldn't you? People like flexibility,
Hmm.
right? But just because 87% of people take that choice doesn't mean, number one, that they're inherently suited to it. And it doesn't mean, number two, that they've that their support structure is in place to help them do that really, really well. And whether they thrive at it or struggle at it will unfold over a period of time, and it will not be immediately visible on day one. That's why I like why you focus on the interview questions so much, because you're trying to basically get predictors. You're trying to
Yeah,
understand ahead of time where those people are likely to struggle. And so um, when we've
yeah.
interviewed people about this, we've often gone back, and then it's a much more nuanced picture in terms of what people like and what people don't like about it.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. I think the it's the art of, I guess, self-election
Yeah,
in a way that we want people to understand, if especially those that have not done it before. Now the good news is, a little bit of a segue, in recent years
of
it's much
course.
more
Yeah,
common. So one of the, hey, have you ever worked from? Yeah, I've worked from home the last 2 years.
yeah.
Great, moving on. Right. But for those that haven't, it's, let me tell you what this is
Hmm.
really like. And we've had a number of people that have gone, I don't think
Yeah,
this is for me. And they confuse work
yeah,
from home with, you know, in the office a couple of days, out of the office a couple of days. They're
yeah,
very different things. Um, and then to kind of get back to your original question around, what sort of things do we look for? How do we, characteristics of employees that succeed, et cetera. So there's a few things that we look for. And some of these feel pretty obvious, but they may not be. So the first one is we try to ascertain their level of personal accountability. Um, you're working in an inherently unsupervised world. When you work from home, it's very easy to appear
yeah,
busy and not be busy. So folks that have this sort of entrepreneurial mindset, this sense of ownership, um, where maybe they're not working the same hours as you, maybe they're a little bit, they're a little more flexible, but the job gets done,
mm,
right? Um, Another one, this comes down to communication. We assess written communication, and I think this is something that's not inherently done in a lot of job interviews. In a remote world, proactive communication, and typically proactive written communication, is the number one way that you maintain trust, right? And trust is the most important thing, right? Let's not forget that. But proactive communication. Hey, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm working on. These are my updates. and being able to articulate that in a clear, concise, well-written way, I think is a bit of a
Yeah.
lost art. Um, so making sure that the employees that we bring in as part of the assessment process, and both as part of the interview process and as a just general statement of those that do well, highly proactive,
Mhm.
well-written communicators tend to do very, very well. Um, the other thing that we find is that those employees that truly embrace the whole notion of home office, we have some employees where and again, it's as an organization, you sort of decide how much of this you
Yeah.
want to support. But a lot of our employees, their home offices are pretty
Mhm.
elaborate. They've taken tremendous pride into building this sort of personal space that where they go and they can focus, and it's a reflection of who they are and their personality. You look around the room, and my home office. I don't know if you can
Mhm.
see them here, but I've got a snowboard, a spear gun, and a guitar, like three
Yeah.
things I like to do. Um, we've got some employees where their home office is just pitch dark kind of cave with video game posters, and it becomes this ultimate expression of who they are. And those that really invest in having that space, right, versus the credenza in the dining room is where they work. um, you know they tend to do very,
Yeah.
very well. And then lastly, that support structure, I can't understate. you know they're not, their work and their home is the same place. You have to make sure the other 16 hours are compatible with
Yeah.
the job, right? And if they're not, you can get yourself into a bad situation pretty
Yeah,
easily.
I think what you're highlighting here, which to me is very interesting, is that there's a clear understanding in your organization, at least, that working in an office and working from home are very different. They're very different experiences. And the people that really thrive at it have understood that and figured out what to do about it. So, for example, what you say about the creating the personalized office space, as it were, that's some people that are getting very thoughtful about what do they need in order to be able to thrive
Hmm.
in this space, right? When you go into an office environment, if it's a well-designed office environment, a lot of offices are not, of course, but if it's a well-designed office environment, then you at least have a starting point, right? You have a starting point of the basic things that you need in order to be able to thrive in that environment, and you're able, in most cases, in offices, to shift from one setting to another setting, from like your own setting, whatever your desk is, or your cube is, or your office is,
Hmm.
to a shared space where you can whiteboard and things like that. And so the office itself is set up to enable that. When you move into an environment where you're working from home, for example, then that becomes your responsibility. And if people take ownership of that responsibility and go, okay, how can I create the most effective, productive space that will help me work? That's an indicator in itself. That's an indicator that the employee understands that there is an opportunity for them to be able to create the best space for them, and a really solid indicator. Um,
I would agree, and I think the other thing about the space, not to be understated, is the level of
yeah,
productivity you get. That when you can create the ultimate environment for productivity, productivity inherently goes up. I can't imagine some of our folks, if they ever had to live in a cubicle
yeah.
farm. Um, I don't think anything would ever get done.
So let's assume you got the right employees, and your employees have
Yep.
developed those skills either through experience or through programs like we offer. Um, let's um, let's think now about the resources that you give those employees to help them thrive. And I'm really curious here as to, given what we've just been talking about, right? What do you
Hmm.
provide? What do you recommend? And then where do you just like take a step back and just let them do whatever they want?
So a few things. I think some of this will be
Hmm.
fairly obvious, right? Number one is you have to spend
Yeah.
money on their home office. It's not a fair expectation to say, hey, at one point maybe it was, but you know, you're going to work from home, you
Hmm.
provide everything, right? If you're going to ask a person to sit at a desk and sit at a chair for an extended period of time, you darn well better provide a
Hmm.
decent chair, or at least give
Hmm.
them the money to. We proactively put money in everyone's paycheck. That is just a stipend for home office. Spend it on whatever you want. You want to save it and buy a $3,000 chair, go for it, right? If if you want to put it towards faster internet, go for it. We set certain minimum standards, but the stipend lets the person decide how they
Mhm.
want to invest the money in the office. Um, some folks like big standing desks, some folks don't. I mean, the list goes on. I think the other thing that that we do to make sure that they work is we prioritize mental and
Mhm.
physical well-being. So
Mhm.
there's two sort of reasons for this, right? One of them is if you're in an office, you're inherently active, right? Even if you kind of sit at a desk all day, you're going to the cafeteria, to the break room, to the coffee shop, you're going to and from, you're inherently more active. When you work from home, we've observed folks that, the the most they do is walk from the bed
Yeah.
to the chair, right? And they'll sit there for 14 hours and work. And while, as a business owner, hey, that's great, you're doing more. As an employer and as a human, I
Yeah.
don't like to see that. So we do prioritize, mental, physical well-being. And we do a lot within the organization to encourage physical activity, and challenges and team activities and contests, all sorts of different things. There's lots of ways to do this. There are companies that specialize in this that will come in and build these programs for you, and we use some of those from time to time. Um, the other things that we do is we put a fairly heavy emphasis on creating personal and
Mhm.
social connections. So we've got this concept of what I call an accidental collision. How do you put a group of employees together so that they'll interact in a way that you
Mhm.
didn't expect, right? Whether it's through, after hours virtual social things, which we've done and had, surprising success with. Ugly sweater contests at Christmas. I
Mhm.
mean, silly things. We have a group that does photography every couple of weeks, probably 3 or 4 weeks. They meet for 2 hours and they share all the pictures they did. And we've got two fairly apt photographers that give people tips. I think we've got a bourbon tasting club, which I need to figure out about because I'm not part of that, and that annoys me a little bit. Um, so these sort of different types
Yeah.
of social interactions, and then the flip side of that is we have a person
Mhm.
dedicated to this, right? So we have a dedicated work from home
Yeah.
leader, right, where all they do is make sure that this piece of the business, almost like an office manager, is running well and is well oiled and the issues are
Yeah.
getting addressed. We're also very proactive on feedback. There's a concept of pulse surveys. We do those, but we probably do them a lot more than most. And we're constantly, almost on a weekly basis, evaluating
Mhm.
sentiment. So, a couple of things. If I think other sort of programs or I think I've
Okay.
covered most of them.
Yeah. I mean, it really is speaking to the same stuff that we've been discussing here, right? The difference of it, and then not an assumption, not an immediate assumption at any rate, that this is just a means of saving a ton of cash, right? As in,
For sure.
as in, we don't have to pay for anything. They can and should pay for everything. Well, sure, they could, right? But if they do, number one, they're less likely to stay. But number two, everything that you're talking about there is something that helps solve a real problem, right? The problem of disconnectedness, right? There are things that you're doing there and that can
Hmm.
help with connectedness, right? Physical activity. We've talked about this on the podcast previously, but there's external data to back up what you're talking about. There was a Stanford study done not that long ago, which looked at the amount of time people spend sitting in a home office setting versus a work from a traditional office setting. People actually spend nearly 2 hours a day more sitting in a home office setting, right? So that's, I mean, if sitting is the new smoking, that's literally killing people, right? So it's a yeah, so
Yeah, I would agree.
it's something that you proactively have to focus on, and I think that's one of the most important thing for leaders to think about here, which is that when you think about moving from a in-office environment to a remote environment, don't think of it in terms of how do I create the exact things that I had in the in-office environment and then recreate those externally, but instead think about the challenges that people will face when they're working out of the office, and then how do you go about addressing those challenges? Which is why things like movement becomes more important, right? It's why things
Yep.
like creating connectedness becomes more important. So it's not a like for like replacement; it's a dealing with the most important challenges associated with having a distributed workforce where people are working from home.
Yeah, I agree. It's we found that I think at the end of the day we probably save money
Hmm.
because we don't have rent, but it is the notion of doing this is not because we want to save money. We probably spend an above average amount on travel to get people
Yeah,
together, right? It's the notion of how do we get the best people and put them in an environment where they can be the most productive, and it aligns with our culture, right? Which is one of be with your family. I have a rule which is don't dare miss your kid's kindergarten graduation because you
yeah,
had a meeting at work. We've got the flexibility that you can do that, and I think generally speaking, it reduces the
hmm,
stress on people. It reduces the amount of anxiety they've got to deal with, and the result is they end up getting
yeah,
more done, right? And we see the results
yeah.
of it.
All right, so let's. I think that brings us fairly neatly to things like policy and process and stuff like that. So,
Mhm.
I know you've got some interesting views in terms of what policies and processes should be in place, but also what burdens you think, well, not even burdens necessarily, but what requirements you think are reasonable to place on employees. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about that? Where do you think it starts in terms of your responsibilities that are instantiated in policy and process, and then what are the requirements you think are reasonable to place on employees?
So there's a few things in there. So first of all, we'll start with managers. As 50 people, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, et cetera. Um, the
Hmm.
the demands that are placed on that sort of middle tier of managers, right? Not the executive team, not the guys doing the work, but the managers that are driving the ship every day. Um, they have to be explicitly taught how to manage people in this world because it's not inherently
Hmm.
intuitive. And we've gone through great pains, and I think we still got a lot of work to do to educate managers how to manage people in a work from home environment. And I think for managers, there's a few things we kind of impress on them. Number one is as a manager, you have to snap to the style and the calendar of the employee. So to give you an example, right there, one of the ways that we work is we use asynchronous work, right? Which means you know we expect you to work roughly 8 hours a day, but we don't necessarily care what those 8 hours are. And we have some employees that generally love the 9 to 5 kind of format, but for a lot of them, they can now snap to things like kids' school schedules, right? Or whatever schedule works in their life. I've got one guy that works in our accounting department. Goes to the gym, or well, he gets up at like 4 a.m. every day, works for about 4 hours, goes
Hmm.
to the gym for about three. I think he takes a nap, and then he works for another 4 or 5 hours. And that schedule like works
Yeah.
brilliantly because we deal with a lot of international clients and customers, and so that early session he's on their calendar, right? And that late session he's on our
Hmm.
calendar, and so it's inherently just more efficient. Um, and so if employees work that way, the last thing you want a manager to do is come in and say my hours are 8 to 5, and if you want to talk to me, you're snapping to my time.
Yeah.
If you're going to be a manager in that world, you have to be ultimately more flexible. You have to kind of snap to the time zone of your directs. Otherwise, you've essentially taken that away from them, right? And it's a learning
Yeah.
curve for managers to kind of get their head around that and almost be the example of what it means to be sort of nonlinear in how you work and how you manage your hours. Um, we also encourage managers to meet in person as much as they can, right? If you can find a way to do it, whether you can piggyback on something else, whether it's sort of the regularly scheduled gatherings that we do, um, that face to face in person is absolutely critical. You don't need a lot of it. You only need it once or twice a year, but it builds that
Hmm.
relationship. Um, we talked briefly about the notion of you get the employee for 8 hours, you got the other 16 that matter, the other two-thirds of the time in their lives, and managers have to understand what's going on in the other two-thirds. Again, and that's if you're in an
Yeah.
office, you leave the office, you go home. As a manager, I kind of don't care because you're going to come back into the office, and that transition can be enough to make to go from a bad environment to a great environment. There's one environment when you work from home,
Hmm.
right? So whether you like it or
Yeah.
not, there's a blend that occurs. And negativity in the other 16 hours bleeds into the workday. Negativity in the workday bleeds into the other 16. Um, and so, for managers, we want them to have an understanding of that, be able to manage to that, and work to that. Um, and then the final thing, and this goes back to, it's a, if you were to say to me, what's the most important thing, for an employee or an employer or a manager to be successful, is trust, right?
Yeah.
If, all it takes, and we've seen this, right? All it takes is for me as a manager to go, hey, I want to talk to Paul, and I can't reach you, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? It's a
Mhm.
very, very slippery slope to that place of, well, Paul's just taking advantages. He's a slacker. He's underperforming. He's
Yeah.
not doing his job. He's fired, right? When in reality, you were
Mhm.
just zoned out with your headset on, working on stuff. And had I walked by your office, I would have. I'm not. I would have said, I'm not interrupting Paul. He's in the zone, right?
Yeah. It literally goes from clearly working to clearly
Like
not
that,
working, and the only difference
right?
is a lack of visibility,
It
which is
it, it
so
is,
interesting,
and,
isn't it?
like,
Yeah.
leaders and managers have to understand that, and they have to be able to account for it. And so I go back to trust, right? Trust is the most important thing. I have to trust
Mhm.
that you are doing your job as best you can. The only way that you can have full trust is with clear, measurable goals and expectations, right? It has to be binary.
Yeah.
I expect you to produce X. Did you produce X? Yes, nothing else matters, right?
Yeah.
You cannot build trust based on what you see. You have to build trust based on what you produce,
Mm.
right? If your job is to write code and I
Yeah.
expect you to, produce 100,000 lines of code next quarter, did you or didn't you? Right? That's my measure of whether or not you are working,
Yeah.
not whether or not you are green on a chat window or whether you
Mhm.
answered a text in 5 minutes,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And that the whole infrastructure of, highly measurable goals, metrics, expectations, whether it's, OKRs or similar to that, is an infrastructure the company's got to put in place and that everyone has to buy into and be on the same page with, because that's the foundational element of trust, right? And without trust, this all
Yeah.
falls apart. The house of cards comes down.
Let's finish up with a discussion about culture, which I think we've been actually like touching on as throughout this discussion. But it sounds as though um, culture, a remote culture, is fundamentally, in many ways, different. A remote first culture is fundamentally different to a good in office culture. I think
Okay.
I'll ask you a bit of a left field question on this. So, as culture is an evolving thing, where do you can you think back at times where you felt like the culture in some way inside your organization or other organizations you worked in is sort of, if you like, slipped a little bit, where you've seen perhaps trust erode, or you've seen things that are not working in the way in which you would want to? And then if you can think of situations like that, what have you done in order to be able to fix that, to get to a point where you do have a truly healthy remote
Um,
first culture?
yes, I would say that, I felt the culture slipping away a couple of times. I felt the trust slipping away a couple of
Hmm.
times over the years. And I can always tie it back to periods where we were not transparent. Um, we
Hmm.
had, we've had various investors in the company over the years, and they all come in and they're sort of aghast at how transparent we are, how much we tell employees about how the
Hmm.
company's doing, how our goals, objectives, where we miss, where we win. The amount of transparency we have is incredible, right? And what I found is that,
Hmm.
transparency breeds trust. And anytime that, we've kind of felt like, people are straying away, or we measure the sentiment is not there, or things are just sort of starting to go sideways, we look back and go, we stop being transparent. And we get back to
Hmm.
that principle of being transparent with people, of being transparent, clear, simple. Here are the goals. Here's what we're doing. Here's what our expectations of you are. Here's how we're measuring it, and here's how you're doing. Right? You get back to those principles, and the trust comes back very, very quickly. Right? Because now we're all looking at the same dashboard, going, "Yep, we're hitting our goal." And I've never once complained about not being able to read a person that's exceeding their goals, able to reach a person, right? Not once
Yeah.
ever. You only start asking questions
Mhm.
when the numbers are missing, and you should,
Yeah.
right? But if you don't have that clear measure of what success means, you're going to fall back on the only thing you naturally know, which is time in chair,
Yeah.
right? The worst situation is we're not hitting a number and I can't get a hold of the person, right? You want to
Yeah.
make sure that you know what the numbers are, you know what the goals are, you know what the metrics are, because now you're not falling back on time and share, right? And that's when trust will start to erode. So transparency, anytime we fell down on transparency, you could see the follow-on of trust begin to erode. You know, things start to go a little bit sideways. You feel like people are maybe taking advantage of the situation, maybe make some bad decisions. You go back to transparency and it all kind of recovers pretty easily. And I've seen that play out a couple of times over the years.
Corey, we'll leave it there. Thank you so
It was a
much for your
pleasure.
time today. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.